This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you my limited archetype guide for INNISTAD Crimson Vow. Over the last week or so, I've been doing a set review, and I've given my thoughts on every single card in the set individually, and today I'm going to take a look at the archetypes. In this video, I'm going to take a look at each of the 10 color pairs and talk about the various synergies within them, and talk about the various cards that support each of these archetypes. This isn't a video where I'm going to talk about the best cards that are just incredible in a vacuum, like premium removal or bombs, unless those cards happen to have some synergy within a particular color pair. If you're interested in my thoughts on that sort of thing, that's what my set review is for, as well as my weekly vlog series, Needs and Notes, where I talk about Limited every Saturday. Alright, let's get into looking at these archetypes. We're going to start by looking at the 5 tribal color pairs in the set, starting with vampires. After all, this is the vampire set. So for each of these color pairs, we're going to begin with a look at a signpost uncommon. These are cards that appear in both of the colors of a given color pair, and they're called signposts because they kind of tell you what you should be doing synergy-wise within a given color pair. And black-red is all about vampires and blood, so each of these color pairs is tribal to some extent, but there's also a mechanical theme that fits within the tribe. There's not really straight up like all about the tribe cards, maybe a little bit with red and green as we'll see, but there's cards within each of these color pairs that support both the mechanical archetype and the tribal aspect. Blood Tithe Harvester doesn't really do anything with the tribal side of things. It's all about making a blood token, and then he can turn into a removal spell where he gives -X to something, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control. So it's all about blood, finding ways to abuse and take advantage of blood. And in a lot of ways, this deck's going to be aggressive. You know, blood doesn't seem like it'd be the most aggressive, but as we'll see, a lot of the blood payoffs are aggressive, and obviously this guy's a 2-mana 3/2, which is pretty aggressive to begin with. So let's look first at blood payoffs at common and uncommon. There's, of course, our Harvester. We've also got Blood Crazed Socialite. It makes a blood when it comes down. It's also a 4-mana 3/3 with Menace, and when it attacks, you can just throw away one of your blood tokens, and it becomes a 5/5 until end of turn. That's nice and aggressive. Gluttonous Guest, a lot less aggressive, but it brings you a blood token, and it gains you life when you sacrifice blood tokens. Wedding Security does not bring a blood token along with it, but if you have other blood around, when it attacks, you get to draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on it, which is quite good. Blood Hypnotist is an aggressive creature. I mean, it can't block. That's really aggressive. And it can use blood. It can cash them in to make other creatures unable to block, which is quite nice. Sanguine Statuette gives you a blood token, and it also becomes a 3/3 creature anytime you sacrifice one. And that's kind of nice. It also has haste, so you know when it comes down, it can immediately attack in some situations. Edgar's Awakening. So this card doesn't say blood anywhere on it, but there's a few cards in the set that pay you off for discarding cards, and obviously these blood tokens have you rummage, which means you discard a card and then draw a card. So something like Edgar's Awakening is sort of a double-faced card, or I guess a split card more accurately. On one side, it's a reanimation spell for 5 mana, but if you discard it to a blood token, you can still pay 1 black and get a creature back from your graveyard to your hand, which is pretty cool. Similarly, Ragged Recluse here is a 2-mana 2/1, and at the beginning of your end step, it'll transform if you've discarded a card this turn, and it'll become Odious Witch, which drains the opponent to life every time it attacks. There's also Restless Bloodseeker here, brings a blood token along anytime you gain life, and it also has the ability to transform using blood tokens, and in this deck, sometimes you'll just play this and you can transform it right away, which is pretty spicy because it immediately becomes a 3/3 that has the ability to still make blood tokens when you gain life, and it has an ability that drains the opponent to life, so it can crank out blood and gain you life and take life away from the opponent. Alright, let's talk now about how you can make blood. There's obviously all of these cards, which we already saw, which are both blood payoffs and make blood, which is quite nice because they're both enablers and payoffs, which is good. But there's a lot of other ways to make blood too. There's really a critical mass of ways to make blood that I think are going to make this deck pretty formidable. You'll really have blood tokens to cash in for value a lot. You've got things like Blood Fountain, which comes down and makes a blood token, and then it's also a card that gets you back 2 creatures from your graveyard later. Synergizes a little bit with the discard stuff because you will be more willing to discard a creature when you rummage if you know you're going to be able to get it back. Ceremonial Knife isn't a card I love, but it is an equipment that makes blood tokens. Blood Servitor, also not a very good card, but if you're really, really into blood, and the more blood the better, it makes blood when it enters the battlefield. Voldaren Epicure is a little 1/1 that does damage to the opponent and makes a blood token when it comes down. So, like Blood Fountain, it can give you blood really early and get you going for some of those payoffs we just looked at. Vampire's Vengeance is both a tribal payoff and it gives you blood. It's a tribal payoff in the sense that it won't hurt your vampires, but it'll hurt everything else, and then you get a blood token. Lacerate Flesh is a pretty mediocre removal spell, but it does have the capacity to make blood tokens. Falconwrath Celebrants looks like a kind of reasonable thing to have at the top of the curve for this deck, as 2 blood tokens can go a long way to helping you close out the game, and they're also a 5 mana 4/4 with Menace. Bloody Betrayal, not a card I love. Threatens aren't great and limited most of the time, but this does make a blood token. Blood Petal Celebrant is a nice aggressive creature that when it dies gives you a blood token. Belligerent Guest, a nice aggressive creature that when it does damage to the player gives you a blood token. You've also got Vampire's Kiss, a card I really don't like a ton, but it's another card that can give you 2 blood tokens. And if blood tokens end up being really valuable, that's a card that could definitely go up. Pointed Discussion, Black's usual draw spell, but also you get a blood token. Grisly Ritual lets you blow up a thing kind of expensively, but you get 2 blood. So the interesting thing here is a lot of these cards, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Decay Zombies in the last set, in the sense that these are all like reasonable cards for the most part that then have blood tacked onto it. And I don't think blood tokens are going to be quite as valuable as those Decay Zombies were, but I could see this being a really powerful archetype for similar reasons, just because you have all these payoffs for having blood, and you don't really give up a lot to make your deck work. All right, let's look now at Vampire Payoffs. Like I said, there's not a ton. This deck is mostly it's about the blood, but there is a vampire sub-theme. Most of these cards, all of these cards that care about blood tokens or make blood tokens happen to be vampires. And you've got things like Gift of Fangs, a dead weight that has the upside of being an aura for one of your vampires. Markov Retribution, a powerful removal spell, assuming you have a vampire to do the damage with. Vampire's Vengeance, we already saw. And then there's also Wedding Invitation. I don't love this card, but it's technically a vampire payoff. It replaces itself too, and the reason it's a payoff is it gives a vampire lifelink in addition to just being unblockable. So what are the rares for this deck? First up, there's a pretty nice build around for the deck in Dying to Serve, which lets you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token the first time you discard a card on a turn, and that's pretty good payoff for when you're activating your blood. Suddenly getting a 2/2 zombie out of it is nice. Dominating Vampire is a tribal payoff. It becomes a better threat and effect the more vampires you have. Olivia's Attendance is a big menace vampire that cranks out blood tokens and can ping stuff. Voldaren Bloodcaster is a nice aggressive flyer that can crank out blood tokens when stuff dies. And if you end up with a bunch of blood, it can transform into Bloodbat Summoner, which can then turn your blood tokens into flyers, which is pretty sweet. Change of Fortune, I don't like this card a lot, but if there's a deck it works in, it's this one. If you have 6 mana, you can activate 2 of your blood tokens and then play this, and that's going to net you some pretty nice value, but it's also a really clunky sorcery that needs significant setup. Kessig Wolfrider, not sort of a direct payoff exactly, but of the red decks around, this is probably the one that will load the graveyard the most because of blood, and that means you may be able to use its ability a little more often in this deck than in others. There's Anya, Maid of Dishonor, who's sort of the signpost rare. She cranks out various blood tokens anytime you have a vampire enter the battlefield, and she can sacrifice blood tokens or creatures to drain the opponent 2 life. There's also a land for this deck in Voldaren Estate. Fixes your mana for vampires, and it can crank out blood tokens, and that gets cheaper the more vampires you have. Falconwrath Forebear is a 3 mana 3/1 flyer that can give you blood tokens when it hits the opponent, and then when you goes to your graveyard, you can sacrifice blood tokens to bring it back. Also worth noting that the black-white rare guy who turns into a coffin, Edgar Markov, I guess is what it is, he works in this deck too, but he's weirdly black-white and a vampire lord, but if you have some fixing, obviously it's going to be pretty good in this deck. All right, let's move to our next color pair, which is green-white, which is humans, but the mechanical theme here is +1/+1 counters, and Sigardian Paladin shows us these things. It's a 4 mana 4/4 that anytime you put a +1/+1 counter on something, it gains trample and lifelink, and that includes itself, so you can put a counter on it and it gains trample and lifelink, and it also has the ability to give other things with +1/+1 counters trample and lifelink too. So what are the other counter payoffs in addition to Sigardian Paladin? Well, There's Allenbach Escort, a 1-mana 1/1 with Vigilance that can sack itself to give a creature that has a counter on it lifelink and indestructible. There's Laid to Rest, which is both a human and a +1/+1 counter payoff. It's going to be really good in this particular color pair. Humans dying draws you cards, and anytime a creature with a counter on it dies, you gain 2 life. Cloaked Cadet is also a +1/+1 counter / human payoff, and it's also quite powerful. It also comes with a training mechanic, which is the main way you're going to get these +1/+1 counters in the format. And yeah, so you draw a card anytime a +1/+1 counter is put on a human the first time each turn anyway, and that includes from training. So the interesting thing here is these cards that are really overtly +1/+1 counter payoffs, this is it. You know, there's 4 uncommons, and 3 of them are really strong. Allenbach Escort's less impressive, but it's worth remembering there are other payoffs of sorts for +1/+1 counters in the sense that creatures with keywords are a good place to put them and things like that. So what are the +1/+1 counters? How do you get them? Well, you've got things like Angelic Quartermaster, which puts them on 2 creatures when it comes down. Anything with training like Griff Rider or Griffwing Cavalry or Parish Blade Trainee. Unholy Officiant isn't a great card, but it does gain counters. Apprentice Sharpshooter, another card with reach. We've already seen the Cadet, which is both a counter and a human payoff. Moldgraph Millipede, not a human. You know, most of these things with training, I think all these things with training are humans. Moldgraph Millipede gets counters, is not a human, and is probably better in the blue-green deck, but I do have it here. Similarly, Packsong Pup is here. It is a wolf and werewolf payoff that we'll talk about more later in the video. But because a lot of werewolves are humans on the front, in fact, all of them are, it can sort of slot into this deck and be okay if you have enough werewolves. Rural Recruit, another card with training that brings a friend along to train it. So let's take a look now at the human payoffs. We've already seen Cloaked Cadet and Laid to Rest, but there's also Resistance Squad, a very good 3-drop that draws you a card if you have a human, and Dawnheart Disciple, a nice little 2-drop that gets +1/+1 until the end of turn anytime a human enters the battlefield, which will make it a nice aggressive creature. Sort of another angle to think about with this deck too is training and, maximizing training. So anything that increases your creature's power and lets it train more things is going to be nice in the deck too. So keep that in mind. So rares, what rares fit into this deck? Well, there's Torrens, a rare, the signpost rare really, comes with training and the ability to make 1/1 green and white human soldier creature tokens with training anytime you cast a creature spell. Very strong. Hopeful Initiate, a 1-mana 1/2 with training that can cash in those counters to naturalize stuff. Savior of Allenbach, a card with training and a very powerful trigger every time it does train. Lets you exile a thing in play or in your graveyard, or your opponent's too, but most of the time you're going to want to target your own graveyard. Sigarda's Summons is one of the spicier payoffs for this particular deck because it just makes your whole board into 4/4 angels, and then all the counters they have on them get added to that, and this is going to come down and win games in this particular deck and not be very good anywhere else. Voice of the Blessed is a Lifegain Payoff, but it also likes +1/+1 counters regardless of where they come from. So it gains, flying and vigilance the more counters it has. And, there's not going to be as much Lifegain in this deck as in Black-White, for example, but it's going to be around, and, this thing will gain counters. Ascendant Pack Leader, a 1-mana 2/1 that can gain counters. Hamlet Vanguard, something that gets +1/+1 tokens for each human you have in play, obviously fits well here. Avabruck Caretaker puts +1/+1 counters on one of your creatures every turn when it's on the front. When it transforms, it puts them on your whole board, which is insane. And it's a huge bomb in any green deck in this entire format, but the counter aspect of it that's why I included it here. Let's move now to red-green, where we've got wolves and werewolves and a go-wide sub-theme. This, of these color pairs, I think is the most tribal. We've seen that the mechanical theme is a little bigger in the other color pairs than the tribal theme is, but I think in this case, the tribal theme's a little bit bigger, which is kind of interesting because the Signpost Uncommon here doesn't tell you that. The Signpost Uncommon here looks like a go-wide card. It is a werewolf, of course, but it has the ability on the front to make wolf creature tokens, and then when it transforms, it gives your whole board +1/+0. And going wide is a theme, but it doesn't seem to be that well supported overall. Meanwhile, there's quite a few decent wolf and werewolf payoffs around, which is a big difference from last time. So let's look at the wolf and werewolf payoffs. You've got Wolfkin Outcast, which costs less mana to cast if you control a wolf or a werewolf, and playing that on turn 4 is pretty good. And one really cool thing about it is even if you're casting it at night and the Wedding Crasher side is what comes down, you still get the 2-mana discount if you have a wolf or werewolf. Additionally, the Wedding Crasher side is an incredibly strong Wolf or Werewolf payoff because you get to draw a card anytime it or another Wolf or Werewolf dies. You've got Hungry Ridge Wolf, a 2-mana 2/2 that gets +1/+0 and trample if you have another Wolf or Werewolf. You've got Into the Night, which is not a card I like a lot. It just doesn't feel like it's going to do enough often enough. But if werewolves turn out to be really good in this format, it will. This is the deck it'll work out in for you because it can make it night whenever you want it. Runebound Wolf is a 2-mana 2/2 that has the ability to damage the opponent equal the number of wolves and werewolves you control. We saw Pack Song Pup earlier. It's definitely better in this deck because you're going to have a critical mass of wolves and werewolves, and it can just start getting huge in a hurry. It's a very nice payoff for the deck. Wolf Strike, I mean, it's going to be good in any green deck, but this is the deck where you want it to be night the most. And so you can just sort of pass your turn, have your werewolves transform, and then use Wolf Strike, and have it be even better because it's nighttime. So now let's look at the going wide side of things. I mean, you've got Infestation Expert, a werewolf that makes a 1/1 when it comes down and when it attacks. Its other side makes 2/1/1s when it attacks. We've already seen Child of the Pack and Savage Packmate. You've also got Rural Recruit, which brings along 2 bodies, and Honeymoon Hearse, which is easier to crew if you have little tokens around. So yeah, I mean, there are plenty of wolves and werewolves in this set. I think the payoffs for wolves and werewolves look more impressive than the payoffs for going wide overall, but it will be sort of a sub-theme within the deck, especially because of Child of the Pack and Infestation Expert, who are both really good werewolves you'll want to play anyway and happen to help you go wide. What rares fit into this deck? Well, we've already seen this, again, absurd in any green deck, but it is a wolf/werewolf, and so it's here. We've got the Wolf Rider again because it's a wolf and it makes wolf tokens. Howling Moon is very much for this deck. You can't really play this card if you're not in this deck because you're not going to get 2/2s often enough out of it to warrant playing it, but you'll be able to have other wolves and werewolves around, and Howling Moon will do some serious work pumping a wolf or werewolf every turn. And then you'll get an occasional 2/2, which will happen anytime your opponent freaks out and really feels like they need to make it daytime again because your werewolves are too scary. And then you'll get a 2/2 out of the deal, which is nice. I've got Glorious Sunrise here. It's a great card in any green deck, but I do like the fact that its first effect looks like it'll be pretty good in this deck because it can go wide. Howlpack Piper is, sort of an Elvish Piper effect that has some werewolf upside in the sense that you can put a thing into play with it, and if it's a wolf or werewolf, then the Piper untaps and so forth. The other side of it isn't actually a wolf or a werewolf, but it is a werewolf, but it's not a payoff. It just sort of is great and draws you cards and stuff. All right, let's move to blue-white now. As usual on Innistrad, blue-white is about spirits. This time around, we have a little bit of a different wrinkle in the sense that it is also an aura deck. And this is because Disturb in this set, which we had in the last set, Disturb in this set doesn't have your creature come back as a creature. It has your creature come back as an aura. And Brindcomber is a really strong signpost uncommon, as pretty much all of them are. And it makes a 1/1 on the ground and a 1/1 flyer, which is already a decent deal. And then it also comes with the ability that anytime it is targeted by an aura spell, you get another flyer. And then it has Disturb, can come back as an aura and give that same ability to another creature. So it is a spirit, and it is a card with Disturb, and it's also an aura that's a payoff for having auras. So it really does a good job of encapsulating what this deck is about. So what are the aura payoffs we have around in addition to this? Well, there's Dawnheart Geist. It likes any enchantment, and in fact, a lot of these payoffs like any enchantment, but auras are going to be the main ones that you have. And what's really great is with these Disturb cards, you're like playing a real creature that then becomes an aura. So you're not really taking the risks sometimes you have to take to play auras, but because in this format, you'll already have gotten value out of the other side of the card. But the Geist gains you life anytime you play an enchantment, and it happens to be a spirit. Heron Blessed Geist is a nice little flyer that when it dies can make spirits from your graveyard, but only if you control an enchantment. You've got Steelclad Spirit, which has Defender, but can lose it when you play an enchantment. Storm Chaser Drake loves to be targeted and draws you cards, so it's another really nice place to put auras. So let's look now at Disturb. I do just want to show you the cards that have Disturb at common and uncommon, just because they really showcase why this deck can actually be good despite being an aura deck, something that's usually really risky. So you've got things like Distracting Geist, which is a nice aggressive creature, really, that taps things down and stuff. but then it can disturb later in the game, come back and give that ability to something else, and that ability can be pretty strong in the later game. You've got a nice little 2/2 in Drogskull Infantry that then becomes an enchantment, Drogskull Armaments, when you disturb it. Same thing with Kindly Ancestor, it can give lifelink to a thing when it's disturbed. Twin Blade Geist gives double strike to a thing when it's disturbed. Binding Geist makes it so you can give -2/-0 to stuff when it's disturbed, like when it attacks. Gutter Skulker, one of the better cards, I think, for this whole deck, because it's a great place to stick these auras, like giving it double strike or lifelink, and it's also unblockable, and if it ever dies, you can just give unblockable to something else. Lantern Bearer, a really good common for the deck, because it's a nice little 1-mana 1/1 flyer, but it can disturb, give something else flying, and +1/+1. Mischievous Catgeist is a 2-mana 1/1 that draws you a card when it hits the opponent, and it can, of course, disturb and give that ability to another thing. And I think most of the auras you want to run in this deck and enchantments you want to run in this deck are going to be these, because you're not really paying the cost of playing like enchantments that are only good if you have a creature in play, or a creature worth putting it on, because they can just be creatures. And I think these are the main ones you want. There are other auras around, including like removal spell ones and enchantments that are removal spells too, and obviously those are good here as well. But I think Disturb is really the core of this deck that's going to work out really well. The front side of most of these Disturb cards is a great place to put the other auras, and then the other side is an aura that's good to put on all of these creatures. You know, Lantern's Lift on Twin Blade Geist, for example. You can just mix and match them a lot of different ways and end up with some pretty powerful creatures that are must kills. Spirits got kind of shafted when it comes to their tribal payoffs. They may be the least tribal of all of these color pairs, because this is it at common and uncommon, and neither of them are very good. Supernatural Rescue is really expensive for what it does. It's not a complete disaster. You know, it does gain flash if you control a spirit, so that's upside. And Geistlight Snare is, you know, an expensive mana link that has some upside. Neither of them are especially good in limited, and I don't think you really need to play either of these to really feel like you got there on this particular deck. So what are the rares here? Well, there's Dorothea, Vengeful Victim, another one of these disturbed creatures. She comes back and has an aura that makes your creature into a mini Geist of St. Traft, in the sense that it makes a 4/4. There's Catilda, Dawnheart Martyr, who checks for the number of spirits and enchantments in play, and has power and toughness equal to that, and then can disturb, of course, into an aura with that same ability. There's Faithbound Judge, which is a card that's going to be good in, obviously, any deck, because it's like a huge blocker that eventually turns into a scary attacker that can eventually disturb into a curse, but because it's a spirit and an enchantment, I put it here. Hallowed Haunting, this is like the big build-around for the set that's horrible in all the other decks. This is basically the only deck it works in, because this is the deck that has spirits and enchantments, so you'll be able to crank out the spirit tokens, and those spirit tokens will be larger because you have access to more spirits. Shouldn't really count on ever giving everything flying and vigilance, but still, the rest of the card is pretty good here. Mirror Hall Mimic is a clone that has Disturb and then can be put on things and can copy that every turn. So that's blue-white. It's mostly, almost entirely, about auras and enchantments. And then there's a spirit sub-theme, especially once you get into the rares and mythics, there's a spirit sub-theme. Less of one, because the common and uncommon payoffs just aren't very good at the lower rarities. So let's move now to blue-black, where we're zombies as usual on the plane of Innistrad, but there's an exploit theme. Exploit is a mechanic you can see here on Skullscob. He is a 2-mana 2/2 that when he comes down, exploits, which means you can sack something to get something. In this case, you get a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And actually, the great thing about him is he's sort of an exploit lord, in the sense that anytime anything exploits, you get that zombie token. And obviously, making zombie tokens is a nice thing to do when you're wanting to exploit in the first place. So what exploit do we have here? So we've got our Scob. There's Diver Scob, which time ebbs a thing, which is pretty strong, comes down, sacks a thing, and forces your opponent to, lose a card and put that card on the bottom or top of their library. Repository Scob can exploit and get you back an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. Stitched Assistant can come down and scry one and draw you a card if you exploit. One thing to remember with all these, by the way, is that you can sack them to themselves if nothing else, and you don't have to sack anything if you don't want to, so they're very flexible. Fell Stinger is a really strong exploit card that draws you 2 and makes you lose 2 life. Mind Leech Ghoul lets you exile a card from the opponent's hand when you exploit it. Rot Tide Gargantua is a 5/4 that edicts your opponent when you sacrifice a thing to it. So These are the exploit cards. Most of them look quite good. I think, really, other than Mind Leech Ghoul and Rottide Gargantua, the others are all quite good. And if you really manage to get a critical mass of them and a couple Skull Scobs, you're going to be in good shape, especially because there's some nice stuff to sacrifice. You've got stuff like Wretched Throng, which isn't great to sacrifice if you only have one, but if you have multiples, every time it dies, you get to search your library for another one, and that means more exploit fodder. Doomed Dissenter, really great exploit fodder. It's one card that gives you 2 bodies, and you can exploit both of them, and get a 2/2 after you sack the Dissenter, which will actually let you upgrade your board while getting whatever exploit trigger you're getting. Persistent Specimen can just keep coming back and being exploited. Undead Butler mills you some when it comes down, and once it dies, you get to put a creature card from your graveyard into your hand, so it's not a bad thing to sacrifice. I've got Lantern Bearer here. It's kind of just a stand-in for all the Disturb cards. We've already seen them. All the blue Disturb cards work well in this deck because you can imagine playing something and sacking your Lantern Bearer after it's no longer relevant, and then you actually still get value out of the card despite the fact that you removed it from the battlefield, because then you can disturb it and give a thing +1/+1 in flying. Desperate Farmer isn't really what you want to be exploiting, but he likes it when creatures get exploited because then he transforms into a 4/3 with lifelink. Biolume Egg is maybe the premier thing to sacrifice to exploit things, but it's an uncommon, so you're not going to get it a ton. But when you do sack it, you get a 4/4 Serpent that can become unblockable if you sack 2 islands. So great thing to sacrifice to exploit. And these are all really nice cards to combine with exploit. What are the zombie payoffs? Well, we've only got 2, but unlike what we saw with spirits, they're both pretty good. Chill of the Grave costs less if you have a zombie, and it gives you a card, it replaces itself and gets a blocker out of the way or whatever. Archghoul of Thraben is a very strong zombie payoff. At worst, when it or another zombie dies, you get to Surveil 1, which I'd already be on board for. But if you have a critical mass of zombies, you're even going to draw cards straight up with it sometimes, which is great. So what are the rares for blue-black that fit well? Well, you've got Geralf Visionary Stitcher, who first gives all your zombies flying, and this deck has a lot of zombies, so there's a tribal payoff at rare. And it also has the ability to sack non-tokens to make zombie creature tokens. So this deck's already going to be running cards that like to be sacrificed. So this gives you another way to do it that is not exploit. There's also Graph Reaver. It's not nearly as exciting as the rest of these rares we're going to see here, mostly because its exploit trigger is not very relevant. You're just not going to see Planeswalkers. But it does have exploit, and it's a zombie, so I have it here. Overcharged Amalgam does have exploit that's actually useful. If you exploit with it, you get to counter a spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, and you get a really efficient flyer. Headless Rider is a great card to combine with exploit and other sacrifice effects, because anytime one of your non-token zombies dies, you get a 2/2 zombie, and that includes itself. In a fail case, you can sack it and get a 2/2. Necro Duality, we've seen basically all of these tribal color pairs have like one really build-aroundy rare or mythic, and this is the one for blue-black. Nobody else is going to want it, but in this deck, it's going to be pretty strong because it will copy all of your zombies, and you're going to have a lot of them. So those are the 5 tribal color pairs. They all have little mechanical things going on that are mostly a larger emphasis. Red-green is maybe the one exception where things are flipped, and the werewolf thing, wolf thing, is the primary thing, and then there's a small sub-theme of going wide. The rest are all, mechanical firstly, and tribal secondly. So let's move into the other 5 color pairs, which are purely thematic and don't have any tribal things going on. First up, let's look at black-white, where we've got Lifegain. This is an archetype we see a lot in black-white. Your signpost here is Markov Purifier, who has lifelink, and when you gain life, you can pay 2 at the end of your turn, and if you do, you get to draw a card. So it turns Lifegain into cards, and he can do it all on his own, because he's a 2/3 with lifelink. So what are the other payoffs? Well, you've got Courier Bat, who really likes it when you gain life, because then it becomes a card that is a 2-for-1. It's a flying Gravedigger for 1 less mana, which is awesome if you've gained life on a turn. Heron of Hope augments how much life you gain. That's what makes it a Lifegain payoff, but it can also gain life all on its own because it can gain lifelink. Panicked Bystander is a 2-mana 2/2 that gains you life anytime another creature you control dies, and then if you have a turn where you gain 3 or more, it transforms into Cackling Culprit, which has the same ability, but it's a 3/5, and it gains Death Touch if you pay 1 generic and a black. It's kind of a secret signpost uncommon because, it costs white on the front, and on the back it has a black activated ability, but, that fits perfectly here. anyway, because those are your colors. Restless Bloodseeker, we saw when we talked about vampires, but it's also good here because it cranks out blood tokens for you and then can transform and, do its life gain thing. So these are the big life gain payoffs. There aren't a ton of them, but both Courier Bat and Heron of Hope look solid or better, and they're both commons. And I think that's going to be really good at supporting this deck. And there's lots of ways to gain life that you can really get good value out of. Things like Diregraph Scavenger, which hates on the graveyard while gaining you life, or Gluttonous Guest, which we saw earlier, likes blood tokens and those gain you life. Parasitic Grasp is a premium removal spell that happens to gain you life. Vampire's Kiss, I have it here. If you end up with multiples of that card that likes it when you gain life and gives you blood tokens, it could end up actually making sense in this sort of deck because it'll synergize with your life gain stuff and your blood payoffs. Dawnheartgeist, again, probably not at its best here, but it is a way to gain life. Sanctify, mostly a sideboard card, but it does gain you life. Traveling Minister is interesting. It's a repeatable way to gain life, which with some of the cards we just looked at is quite potent. We've also got Kindly Ancestor, which has lifelink, which also can disturb into an aura with lifelink. There's also Desperate Farmer, who we've already seen, but it has lifelink. So you have these repeatable ways to gain life. You've got lots of ways to do it, and there's some nice payoffs even at lower rarities for doing it in the first place. What are some rares that fit in well here? Well, there's Sorin. He's a bomb. He's going to be good in any deck, but the guys he makes, the creatures he makes, have lifelink, and he also has an ability that drains 13 life. So I put him here. He's probably a little better here than everywhere else, but he's great everywhere. Voice of the Blessed, we saw when he talked about +1/+1 counters. It's probably even better here. It's probably just the best life gain payoff in this format. So, you're really going to want to get them. Unfortunately, it's rare, so getting multiples is unlikely. But if you can play this on turn 2 in this deck, it's going to be absolutely insane. Henrika Domnathi I have here because of her ability to pump lifelinkers once she transforms, and she can gain you life with lifelink. We've also got Edgar Charmed Groom here, which we saw. I mentioned him earlier. You can splash him in that vampire deck that's mostly black-red because he is a vampire lord. But he's also in this color pair, and when he transforms into his coffin, he gives you lifelink tokens, so that's why I have him here. All right, let's move to blue-green now, which, all of these color pairs have changed somewhat, at least, from what we saw in Midnight Hunt, but that's less true of blue-green. It's once again self-mill. It does have a little bit different of a focus. Vilespawn Spider here mills you every turn, one card, which is good. It's also got great starting stats, but its activated ability is where you see that the mill focus is a little bit different. In particular, the blue-green deck this time around wants creature cards in your graveyard. So you don't have as much value to gain because you don't have flashback. You do have access to disturb, of course, but you really want to be running like a critical mass of creatures to power this sort of thing. And the Vilespawn Spider is great because it enables by milling you, and then it's an amazing payoff because, you can populate your table with like 9 1/1 tokens, which is pretty spicy, but it only looks at creature cards. And so you're going to be wanting a high number of creatures in this deck, which was less true in the blue-green deck that we saw in the last format, but in a lot of ways it is the same deck. So how do you mill yourself? Well, there's our Spider, of course. You've also got Fear of Death, which is both a way to mill yourself and a mill payoff in the sense that it weakens the creature even more the more cards that are in your graveyard. Scattered Thoughts, it doesn't say the word mill on it, but it lets you look at 4 cards, put 2 in the graveyard and 2 into your hand. Screaming Swarm is interesting. It's this, decently sized flyer that mills every time it attacks. And then it's also a mill payoff in the sense that if it gets milled, you can still put it back into your library. And it's also a way, like if you're really milling yourself a bunch and you have the mana to do it, you can just keep putting it back in your library and hopefully not mill out. Thirst for Discovery lets you draw cards, but you discard 2 or 1, depending on what you do when you cast it. Crawling Infestation is looking like it's going to be a very powerful engine in this deck. It's another card that checks for creatures in your graveyard, in addition to also milling you every turn. And anytime a creature goes to your graveyard, the first time each turn anyway, you get a 1/1 insect creature token. So it loads up your graveyard for your payoffs, like your Vilespawn Spider or whatever, and also populates the board at the same time. Moldgraph Millipede we saw earlier. This is really the ideal deck for it. It mills some cards, and it likes creatures in the graveyards and gets bigger. Mulch is a card that you can pay 2 and mill as many as 4 cards, which is pretty cool. Soul Cipher Board, this is a really good deck for it. It's kind of a weird card, and it seems like it might be a little slow, but if you're milling yourself, it's going to gain Omen counters a lot more quickly, and that means it's going to become Cipherbound Spirit a lot more quickly, which is a card that lets you dig deeper into your library and still discard cards, which this deck wants to do. I don't love Selhoff and Tumor, but if there's a deck for it, it's probably this one. This deck likes creature cards in the graveyard, and this lets you discard those to draw new cards. And we'll see that it's, these milling yourself cards, a lot of them are payoffs too, but there's even more payoffs that look for creatures specifically in the graveyard, in addition to the ones we've already seen. Like the Vilespawn Spider and Soul Cipher Board and Moldgraph Millipede and Crawling Infestation, they all really care about creatures. So what are the other payoffs? Well, you've got Cobbled Lancer. So one of the interesting things you have going on here that I'm not sure how I feel about mechanically is that there are a few cards at common and uncommon in blue that exile things from your graveyard for an effect or whatever. And that seems like it's sort of going to have some dis-synergy with the idea that you want a bunch of creatures in your graveyard, but it may turn out that you can sort of do both and still get some pretty nice value. And Cobbled Lancer is one of these things, because first it has to exile a creature card from your graveyard or you can't even play it, which is good because it's a 1-mana 3/3, and it's a payoff because if you mill it, you can exile it to draw a card and basically get a free card out of milling it. It'll be at its best in this deck because you're likely to have a creature card to cast it in the first place, and you're more likely to mill it than the other decks are. Dreadlight Monstrosity, not a card I love, but it checks for a card in exile, and that means it fits in reasonably well here in the sense that, you're more likely to have exiled cards because of things like Cobbled Lancer. It also works okay in the blue-white deck. It's not a bad place to put some of those auras, things to ward, and stuff like that. Fear of Death, we already saw. It's both a payoff and a way to mill yourself. Screaming Swarm, we've already seen. It's both a payoff and a way to mill yourself. So we've also got Skywarp Scob, which is kind of like the Lancer in the sense that it has an extra effect, but only if you exile 2 creature cards from your graveyard. And if you do, when it comes down, you draw a card, which is powerful. But again, you're kind of being pulled in 2 weird directions where you have things like the Centipede that's like, hey, put a bunch of creatures in your graveyard and I'll be really good. And then you have a card like the Scob that cashes those creatures in. So it's a little weird, but I think there's probably enough self-mill that you can get away with doing both. Brambleworm, ideally you cast this thing, but it is nice that you kind of get 5 free life out of it if you do mill it. Crawling Infestation, a mill payoff, and a way to mill yourself. Moldgraph Millipede, which we already saw. Reclusive Taxidermist, another card that likes cards in your graveyard. It becomes a 4/4 if you have 4 or more creature cards in there. Retrieve, this is going to be the best deck for it. Other decks aren't going to have that easy of a time of getting both a creature and then a non-creature permanent into the graveyard. But obviously in this deck, you're going to have no problem because you're going to be milling everything between creatures, lands, enchantments, and so forth, and you'll be able to get some nice value out of it. Binding Geist, I have this here just as a stand-in for all the Disturb cards. They're cards you get value out of even if you mill them. And there's also Soul Cipher Board, which we saw. It can help you mill, and it's a mill payoff. So what are the rares here? Well, you've got Patchwork Crawler, which likes it when you have creatures in your graveyard, but it's another card that exiles things. It gets bigger when you do, and it gains their activated abilities. Gralnock is the signpost rare of sorts here. It mills you, and anytime a card goes from your library to your graveyard, that card effectively goes into your hand, so he's an insane engine for this deck. Dollhouse of Horrors likes it when you have creatures in your graveyard. You can make copies of things that are in your graveyard that get progressively larger depending on the number of constructs you have. So that's blue-green. It's about self-mill, and it's about creatures in the graveyard specifically. Let's look now at blue-red, where we have, slightly different take on what we've seen a lot recently in blue-red, and that is a spell deck. It's a little more all-encompassing this time because it's more about non-creature spells, and that's something we've seen before, but the last several sets, a lot of sets recently, it seems like they've all been instant and sorcery. This one isn't. It's non-creature spells, and that's something worth remembering. Wandering Mind is our signpost uncommon here. Lets you look at the top 6 when it comes down, and you reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. And this is a deck where you're going to want like 10 non-creature, non-land spells, and you're almost guaranteed to hit something when you do cast Wandering Mind if that's the case, and that is really what you're going to want to be doing in this deck. So what are the other non-creature spell payoffs? Well, we've got our Wandering Mind. We've also got Cruel Witness, which we saw earlier. It lets you surveil every time you play a non-creature spell. Repository Scob is an exploit creature that we saw earlier. Here it gets you back an instant or sorcery, and that's what's good for this deck. Whispering Wizard looks like maybe the premier payoff for the deck in that it cranks out spirit tokens with flying anytime you play a non-creature spell. Frenzied Devils, it seems a little overcosted to me, but there are definitely going to be turns where you can just really hurt your opponent with it because you have so many cheap spells. You've got Kessig Flame Breather, which hits the opponent for 1 every time you play a spell. There's Lamholt Raconteur, which has the same non-creature spell payoff as the Flame Breather, but it can also transform into Lamholt Ravager, which then does 2 damage. Getting like multiple copies of those seems like it's going to have some serious power in this format, since, that's just going to add up a lot of damage. So I'm not including every instant and sorcery in the set. Obviously, those are all extra good. Premium removal that's blue and red's good in any deck, but it's extra good here because you have all these nice payoffs. But I did want to talk about a few non-creature spells that I think are at their best in this deck and maybe not that interesting to play in other decks. So you've got things like Chill of the Grave. I mean, I think this is a reasonable playable, but any sort of effect that lets you draw a card while also triggering your instant or sorcery payoffs is extra good here. So anything that's a cantrip is going to be better here than it is in most decks. Lunar Rejection, an example of that too. It's a bounce spell that draws you a card, but the draw a card part is what makes it potentially interesting because you can chain some triggers together or make sure you keep triggering your stuff. Ancestral Anger. Don't love this card, but if there's a deck for it, this is it, because you can sort of chain a couple of these together, get a big boost like on your Frenzied Devil, and you're also drawing cards and getting all kinds of other triggers. Reckless Impulse. This is a draw spell, and it's one that ideally will give you more ways to trigger stuff in addition to triggering stuff itself. Lantern of the Lost. So this is where the non-creature spell side of things comes in. Hates on the graveyard a little bit, which isn't amazing, but it also replaces itself pretty cheaply, which is something this deck might be interested in. Same thing with Wedding Invitation. It replaces itself. It'll trigger your stuff, and that makes it particularly interesting for this deck. Obviously, again, lots of instants and sorceries in this set that are going to be good in this deck, but these are some cards that I think are going to be at their best in this particular deck and not be nearly as good in others. Rares, there's really only one, and it's Manaform Hellkite, which is a huge bomb, but it is one you kind of have to build around a bit because it likes it when you cast non-creature spells. It gives you a Dragon Illusion creature token with Flying and Haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast a non-creature spell, so it's a great card for this deck. Let's move now to red-white, where, as usual, we're looking at aggro. It doesn't have any sort of tribal theme. There's not even really a huge mechanical theme. I'll talk a little bit about one sort of sub-theme within the deck when we look at the commons and uncommons, but Markov Waltzer here really shows you what this deck's about. This deck has a lot of creatures that have haste and, evasive abilities, and lots of cards that pump other creatures so that you can sort of push through damage more effectively. And the Waltzer adds 3 power to the board all on its own and can spread it around every combat, which is really powerful and going to allow for attacks you just didn't have otherwise. So, I'm not going to show you every single creature in this set, but I'm going to show you a few cards that I think will be particularly well suited to this really all-out aggro red-white strategy. So you've got things like the Waltzer, which will make attacks happen that just couldn't before. Same thing with something like Daybreak Combatants, which comes down and adds 4 power to the board immediately. It's damage with haste. It's not nearly as good as the Waltzer because it can't spread things around and it doesn't have flying, but it's kind of like a poor man's version of Markov Waltzer, and it works pretty well here. Blood Petal, Celebrant, any of these creatures that are challenging to block are going to be extra good when you can pump them, especially when ones that have first strike like the Celebrant. Hungry Ridge Wolf is a nice 2-drop here that will sometimes gain Trample, allowing it to really be a beating for your opponent. Combat Tricks are pretty welcome in a deck like this, and Sure Strike is a nice one. You can win almost any combat with it. There's nice 2-drops around like Perish Blade Trainee. Anything with training in white is going to be pretty good in this deck, just like it is in green-white. You're not going to get as many +1/+1 counter payoffs, but any creature that is good at attacking and gets better when it attacks, that's what this deck is about. Militia Rallier can't attack alone, so it really needs to have some friends, and this deck will have a lot of friends, and it has the ability to untap creatures, which can include itself, and it can still block, so that's a thing. Fleeting Spirit, a nice little aggressive creature, is a 2-mana 3/1 that can sort of wreak havoc on your opponent all game long because of its ability to blink itself. Then once you have cards in the graveyard, it's incredibly difficult to block because, you can give it first strike. This card, I think, is maybe like a secret signpost uncommon for the deck. It's not 2 colors, but I think Arm the Cathars is going to be quite good in this deck. Its ability to, imagine pumping any of these creatures we have on the screen right now. It's going to be really strong if you just play it on turn 4 after curving out. It can just do a ton of damage early and break through board states late. It's going to be quite good in this deck. I've got Distracting Geist here. It obviously is about the blue-white deck to some extent, But that ability to make one thing unable to block, that's a huge deal in a deck like this. It just opens the floodgates. You can suddenly swing with your whole board when you get one blocker out of the way, and that's what it enables. This deck also has access to all of these white cards with Disturb, in addition to the Geist, and they're in general going to be pretty nice because you're going to have creatures that you might want to augment later in the game to make sure they can keep rumbling. Alluring Suitor is quite an impressive card for the deck. It's a card that sort of showcases a sort of mechanical sub-theme here, which is that you want to be attacking with like two things. It transforms when you do, and when it does, it becomes a 3/3 with Trample, gives you 2 red mana, and you can pay 2 red mana to then give +1/+0 to itself and then another creature, which is pretty nice. Another effect that makes sure you can keep pushing damage through. Rares, there's a couple that I think are well suited here. You've got Cemetery Gatekeeper. It's a 2-mana 2/1 first strike, which is appealing, but this deck is going to be sort of the fun police. It's going to be the most aggressive deck in the format. Maybe Black-Red will be close too. And this is the kind of card that if you play and you're the beatdown and you're just like making your opponent lose life every time they play a creature, which you're going to lose life too, but if you're the beatdown, you don't care. You just keep attacking them. It's going to speed up their clock, and it's going to be pretty nice. Creepy Puppeteer, another card that likes it when 2 things attack, and it can turn one of your other creatures into a 4/3 when it comes down and has haste. So red-white is aggro. There's sort of a theme of, pump your creature's power, keep them rumbling. That's kind of always the red-white theme, but it does seem a little more pronounced here than we've seen in the past. A lot of ways to pump creatures at instant speed or with cards that have haste and stuff like that. Now let's move to the last of the color pairs, which is black-green, which is all about toughness. As Ancient Lumberknot shows you here, this is a card that makes it so all your creatures that have higher toughness than power do combat damage equal to their toughness rather than their power. So the Lumberknot is effectively a 4-mana 4/4 in combat. This color pair does not seem like one that is super well supported. There's always one, and this one doesn't look like it's quite there. And I'll show you why. So what are the toughness payoffs? Well, you've got the Lumberknot, of course. You've got Flourishing Hunter, which gains you life equal to the greatest toughness you control, but it's a card that'll be pretty nice in any green deck at the top of the curve. One of the most exciting payoffs for this deck is Catapult Fodder. It has the ability to transform once you have 3 or more creatures that each have toughness greater than their power, and once that happens, it becomes Catapult Captain, which is pretty impressive. Lets you start giving up creatures to do damage to your opponent equal to their toughness. You've also got Dormant Grove, which is a nice card. It's another card that's good in like any green deck, but it does check for a creature with high toughness, and if that ever happens, you get Gnarled Grove Strider, a creature that has high toughness. But this is it, okay? You've got one common that sort of supports the deck, but it's a 6-drop, and then the other stuff is all uncommon. Now, there are a few other, interesting cards for this deck that will be pretty nice in this deck because they have such high toughness. And those are Apprentice Sharpshooter, Unhallowed Phalanx, and Gluttonous Geist. And the Phalanx especially has combo potential. If you do get those uncommon payoffs, the Phalanx is effectively a 13/13 when you have your Signpost uncommon in play, and can be sacrificed to the Catapult Captain to do 13 to your opponent. And that's awesome. But these are 2-card combos that you have to get, or this deck doesn't look like it has many legs. These other 2 cards are nice. They're both 3-mana 1/4s that will be quite good in this deck for the same reasons. This isn't all the cards with high toughness. I just showed you 3 common ones that I think will be particularly good here. There is one rare I want to mention. It's another 1/4, so it fits in well here, and then it's just a powerful card in general, milling you every turn and giving you some sort of value. But yeah, doesn't feel like black-green is super well supported in this format. There will be times where you pull off some stuff, but right now I would think it seems the least easy to make come together of all of these color pairs, and I'm not super high on it. It's kind of like I'll believe it when I see it kind of deck. Well, that's an overview of the archetypes in Innistrad Crimson Vow. Well, this marks the end of my usual set review content. Lots more Crimson Vow content is on the way, including draft videos and discussions about how the format evolves. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to share it and like it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past content, including my card-by-card set review of this set, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you like what I do and want to go the extra mile in supporting my channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.